At 2 in the morning, I received a desperate call from my daughter. By the time I found her hidden inside a roadside motel after a night of rain, her husband had already convinced everyone she had walked away on her own while quietly taking control of everything she owned. I made one phone call that changed everything. When the truth finally came into the open, my son-in-law looked at me and shouted, "What have you done?" I looked back at him and answered, "I'm so glad you're here with Dad's Revenge Stories. Which city or country are you watching this from? Tell me in the comments." Please note this story includes fictional elements crafted for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or locations is strictly coincidental, but the underlying message brings clear value. My name is Robert Callahan, and I am 68 years old. I want to tell you that I almost did not answer the phone that night. It was 2 in the morning, the kitchen was dark, except for the light above the stove that I always left on since Margaret passed, and I was sitting at the table with a glass of water I had not touched. Old men do not sleep well. That is something nobody warns you about when you are young. You think the hard part of getting old is the body. Nobody tells you it is the nights. The phone screen lit up on the table and my daughter's name appeared. Emily. I felt something loosen in my chest, the way it always did when I saw her name, that specific kind of relief a parent carries without knowing it. The constant, low-level worry that only quiets when you know they are safe. I picked up on the second ring. Emily. The connection was poor. I could hear wind or something that sounded like wind, and a muffled quality to the line that made me press the phone harder against my ear. Dad. Her voice was wrong. Not wrong the way a sick person sounds, or someone who has been crying. Wrong in a way I did not have a word for yet. Careful. Pressed small. Sweetheart, it's 2 in the morning. Are you all right? A pause. In that pause, I heard her breathing change, and I heard something else underneath it, a kind of stillness that did not match the noise on the line. Dad, I need you to listen to me. She was speaking quietly, the way you speak when you do not want to be heard by someone nearby. If I don't call you back tomorrow, I need you to remember something. My hand tightened around the phone. Emily, what's going on? Where are you? Don't trust anything Jason tells you. Her voice cracked on his name just slightly, just enough. Whatever he says, Dad. Whatever story he gives you. Promise me you won't just accept it. Emily. I stood up from the table without deciding to. My knees ached and I did not notice. Tell me where you are right now. I can't. The wind sounded again louder. I just needed to say it. I love you, Dad. I love you so much. Emily, listen to me. I'm getting in the car right now. Tell me where. The line went dead. I stood in my kitchen in the dark and called her back 4 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. Her voice on the recording, bright and ordinary, asked me to leave a message. I called the house number she shared with Jason. It rang 11 times. I counted because counting gave my hands something to do. I told myself there were explanations. Couples argue. Marriages go through hard seasons. Emily had always carried her worries quietly, the way her mother used to, tucking things down until they were manageable. Maybe she and Jason had a bad night, and she called me in an emotional moment, and then thought better of it. Maybe the phone died. Maybe she fell asleep. I sat back down at the kitchen table and looked at the glass of water. I had lived in this house for 31 years. Margaret and I raised Emily in the bedroom down the hall. The one with the yellow walls she chose herself, at age 7, absolutely certain that yellow was the correct color for a room. When Margaret got sick, Emily drove 3 hours every weekend for 14 months without being asked. When Margaret died, Emily sat with me in this kitchen for 2 days straight and let me talk about nothing, because talking about nothing was the only way I knew to survive the weight of everything. I knew my daughter. I knew the sound of her voice when she was frightened. That was not a woman calling her father at 2 in the morning because of a bad night. I did not sit down. I stood in the kitchen with the dead phone in my hand and thought about every conversation I had with Emily over the past year, pulling each one up the way you handle something fragile. She had seemed tired at Thanksgiving. I had noticed and told myself it was work. She had been quieter than usual at Christmas, but Jason had been charming and attentive, refilling her glass, finishing her sentences, and I had watched them together and thought they looked like a couple finding their rhythm. I had seen what I wanted to see. I changed my shoes at 2:30 in the morning and got in the car. I did not have a plan. I had a direction: Emily's neighborhood 12 minutes away, and the particular kind of forward motion that is the only thing available to a person who cannot sit still and cannot sleep and cannot convince themselves that waiting until morning is the right answer. A late winter storm had settled over Sacramento, while I slept the steady, quiet kind that does not announce itself and simply arrives, and the rain came down in thin gray lines across my headlights as I pulled out of the driveway. The streets were empty at that hour. I drove through 3 yellow lights and did not slow for any of them. I circled Emily's block twice. Jason's car was in the driveway. The house was dark. I parked 2 streets over and sat in the rain with the engine running, and understood that arriving at a dark house at 2:30 in the morning with no plan and no evidence was not going to find my daughter. It was only going to warn the man inside that I was looking. I drove home. I made coffee I did not drink, and I watched the clock on the microwave change numbers until the sky outside the kitchen window began to go from black to gray. At 5:47, I heard a car slow on the street outside. Then footsteps on the porch. Then a knock at the front door, 3 measured knocks, not urgent, not angry, just firm and deliberate. I already knew who it was before I crossed the room. I opened the door. Jason stood on my porch in the early light, his eyes red at the edges and his shoulders pulled in, wearing the particular expression of a man who has practiced his grief carefully and arrived ready to perform it. "Robert," he said, and his voice broke on exactly the right syllable. I didn't know who else to call. I stepped back from the door without inviting him in. He came in anyway. That was the first thing I noticed. Not his red eyes or his untucked shirt or the way he pressed his hand against his mouth, like a man holding back something unbearable. The first thing I noticed was that he did not wait to be asked. He simply moved through my doorway the way a person moves through a space that already belongs to them, and he sat down in the armchair by the window, Margaret's chair, the one nobody had sat in since the funeral, and he dropped his face into his hands. "She's gone, Robert." His shoulders shook. I woke up at midnight and she wasn't there. Her closet was half empty. She left a note. He reached into his jacket pocket and held out a folded piece of paper. I did not take it immediately. I looked at his hand first, steady despite the performance his shoulders were giving, and then I crossed the room and took the note. The handwriting looked like Emily's. Same looping letters, same slight leftward lean. But something sat wrong in my chest as I read it. The note said she needed space, that she had been struggling for a long time, that she was sorry for worrying everyone. It was written in the careful, neutral language of someone who has never met my daughter. Emily did not write carefully and neutrally. Emily wrote the way she talked, with underlines and exclamation points and little arrows connecting thoughts she forgot to put in order. More than that, she signed her name at the bottom with a capital E that stood perfectly closed and round. Emily had never closed her capital E that way. Not once in 68 years of birthday cards and grocery lists and notes slipped under my door when she was a teenager. Her E always opened at the top, a habit she picked up from Margaret, a small inherited imperfection that I had seen 10,000 times without ever thinking about, until this moment when its absence hit me like a cold hand pressed flat against my sternum. I folded the note and set it on the side table. "When did you last speak with her?" I asked. "We had dinner together." Jason lifted his face from his hands. His eyes were genuinely red, I noticed, though. Redness can be produced by means other than grief. She seemed quiet. I thought she was tired. I fell asleep on the couch watching television, and when I went to bed, she was gone. "Did you call anyone?" "I called the police first thing this morning. They said since she left a note and took her belongings, there's nothing they can investigate. She's an adult who chose to leave." He paused, swallowing. "Robert, I have to be honest with you. Emily has been struggling with her mental health for a while now. I've been trying to protect you from worrying, but she's had some really dark periods. The doctors call it—" "Which doctors?" I said. He blinked. "What? Which doctors has she been seeing? Give me a name." Something moved across his face there and gone in under a second, too fast to be called an expression. Then his eyes filled, and he shook his head slowly. "I don't think now is the time to—" A knock at the front door saved him from finishing the sentence. Maggie Collins stood on the porch with a foil-covered plate and the particular expression of a woman who has decided that food is the correct response to every crisis. She had lived across the street from me for 22 years. She had brought the same foil-covered plate when Margaret died and when I had my hip surgery, and now here she was, again reliable as weather. "I saw Jason's car," she said, looking past me. "Oh, honey." She moved around me and went directly to Jason, setting the plate on the coffee table and putting both hands on his shoulders the way grandmothers do. "We are all just devastated. Emily is such a sweet girl. I'm sure she just needs some time." Jason pressed his hand over Maggie's and closed his eyes. "Thank you, Maggie. That means everything." Maggie turned to look at me with an expression I recognized. It was the look people give the difficult member of a family, the one who is not crying appropriately, the one who is making everyone uncomfortable by refusing to participate in the agreed-upon version of events. "Robert, you look terrible. Have you slept at all?" "No," I said. "You need to rest. Jason is handling things. You don't need to." "I'm fine, Maggie." She pressed her lips together. Jason stood and embraced her with the ease of a man who understood exactly how to make an older woman feel necessary, and she patted his back and told him Emily was lucky to have such a devoted husband. And I stood by the window and watched all of it, and said nothing that I was thinking. After Maggie left, Jason stood at my door with his jacket in his hand, and his face arranged back into sorrow. "I'm going to keep trying to reach her," he said. "If she contacts you, please let me know right away. She needs professional support, not people encouraging her to—" "I'll be in touch," I said. I closed the door before he finished the sentence. I stood in the hallway and listened to his footsteps cross the porch, descend the steps, move down the front walk. I heard his car door. I heard the engine. I heard him drive away. Then I went to the side table and picked up the note again. I looked at that closed, perfect capital E for a long time. Emily had not written this letter. I did not know yet where my daughter was, or what had been done, or how far back the planning went. But I knew that. And knowing one true thing, even a small one, was enough to start. I changed my shoes at 11 in the morning and drove to Emily's neighborhood without calling ahead and without a plan. That was not like me. I had spent 40 years as a contracts manager for a mid-sized construction firm in Sacramento, and the habit of planning had settled into my bones the way cold settles into old joints, deep and permanent. I did not make moves without knowing the next three. But that morning, I could not sit in my kitchen any longer with the untouched coffee and the folded note on the side table, so I drove the 12 minutes to Emily's street and parked 2 blocks away and started walking. I told myself I was getting air. Old men need air. That is a reasonable thing. The neighborhood was quiet, the way residential streets are quiet on weekday mornings, the particular stillness of a place where everyone has already left for somewhere else. A sprinkler ran in someone's front yard. A dog watched me from behind a chain-link fence with the serious expression dogs reserve for strangers they have decided not to trust. I walked past Emily's house without stopping. The curtains were drawn. Jason's car was gone. The flower boxes under the front windows, the ones Emily had planted herself 2 springs ago with red geraniums, needed water. The geraniums were still alive, but only barely, their leaves curling inward at the edges, the way things curl when they have been ignored for longer than they should have been. I kept walking. I did not know what I was looking for. I knew only that Emily had called from somewhere, and then the line had gone dead, and the phone had not been at the house, because Jason would have found it. So it had to be somewhere else. People who are frightened and trying to leave a record do not keep things where they can be taken away. They hide them, or they discard them, depending on how much time they have. I walked 3 blocks north, then 2 blocks east. I checked the small park on the corner, the bus shelter, the gap between a real estate office and a dry cleaner, where teenagers sometimes gathered in the evenings. I felt faintly ridiculous, a 68-year-old man in a windbreaker examining sidewalk cracks and public trash cans like something out of a television program my late wife would have made fun of gently. Then I found it. The 3rd public trash can on Meridian Avenue, the green municipal kind, bolted to a metal post, had its lid sitting slightly crooked. I lifted it. Underneath a fast food bag and a crumpled newspaper wedged against the inside wall of the can was a phone in a cracked green case. Emily had bought that case in October. I remembered because she held it up during our video call and said the color reminded her of the kitchen in the house where she grew up. Our kitchen. My kitchen. The one with the light above the stove that I never turned off anymore. My hands did not shake when I reached in and picked it up. I was surprised by that. I walked back to my car and sat in the driver's seat with the door closed and the phone in both hands. The screen was cracked badly across the lower half, but the device still powered on when I pressed the side button. It asked for a passcode. I tried Emily's birthday. It opened. Most of the apps had been cleared. The photo library was empty. The text messages had been deleted. But the voice memo application still had one file in it 18 seconds long, marked with the previous night's timestamp unsent and undeleted, as though whoever cleared the phone had been interrupted before finishing. I pressed play. The recording was poor quality wind noise underneath, and something that sounded like a car door in the distance. Emily's voice came through anyway, close to the microphone, barely above a whisper. "Dad, if you find this..." A breath. "Jason is not who you think he is. He's been pressuring me for months. I signed things I didn't understand he said they were." A sharp sound cut through the recording. Not a voice. A sound like something striking a hard surface nearby, sudden enough to make Emily go silent. Then 18 seconds became 17, 16, and the file ended. I sat in my car on Meridian Avenue and played it 3 more times. I did not cry. I pressed my thumb against the screen to keep it from going dark, and I listened to my daughter's voice tell me she had been afraid for months while I called her every Sunday and asked if work was going well, and accepted whatever answer she gave me because accepting it was easier than the alternative. I called Sandra on my own phone. Sandra Kowalski was Emily's aunt on her mother's side. The younger sister, Margaret, always described as the practical one in the family, which coming from Margaret was the highest compliment she knew how to give. Sandra picked up on the second ring. "Robert, I've been sitting here waiting for you to call." Something about the way she said it made my throat tighten. "You already know something's wrong. When Emily called me the night before last." Her voice was steady but effortful, the steadiness of someone gripping the edge of a table. "It was almost 2 in the morning. I was asleep. I saw the missed call when I woke up, and I told myself she would call back. And then Jason called me in the morning with his story about the depression, and I—" She stopped. "Robert, I should have called you immediately. I didn't. That's on me." "Can I come over?" I asked. "I'll put coffee on," Sandra said. "And Robert, before you come, I need to tell you something about a photograph." Sandra lived 20 minutes from me in a craftsman bungalow on Oleander Street that she had owned since her divorce 14 years ago. Margaret used to say that Sandra decorated her home the way she lived her life practically, and without apology, every piece of furniture chosen for use rather than appearance. Every surface clear of clutter except for the things that genuinely mattered. Walking into Sandra's house always felt like walking into a room where someone had already thought everything through. She met me at the door before I reached the porch steps. That told me something. Sandra was not a woman who waited at doors. "Come in," she said, and the way she said it told me the coffee was already poured, and she had already decided what she was going to show me and in what order. We sat at her kitchen table. She had printed something from her computer and placed it face down in front of her chair. She did not turn it over immediately. Instead, she wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at me the way Margaret used to look at me when she was deciding whether I was ready to hear something difficult. "Emily called me at 1:47 in the morning," Sandra said. "I saw the time on my missed call log. I have looked at that timestamp approximately 200 times since yesterday morning." Her jaw tightened. She needed me and I was asleep, and I did not call her back until it was already too late to matter. "Sandra, let me finish." She pressed her lips together. "When Jason called me the next morning with his story, something felt wrong. Not wrong enough that I said so out loud. Wrong enough that I went back through every photograph Emily had sent me in the past 3 months and looked at them again. Really looked. She turned the printed page over and slid it across the table. It was a photograph I had already seen. Jason had posted it on his social media page 2 weeks before Emily disappeared. A Sunday afternoon picture the caption described as a perfect fall day. Emily and Jason stood in front of their house, the red geraniums visible in the window boxes behind them, both of them smiling. I had looked at it when Jason posted it and thought they looked happy and felt relieved and moved on with my morning. Sandra set her finger on Emily's left arm. "Ah, look at her sleeve," she said. Emily was wearing a light blue cardigan with 3/4 sleeves, the kind she favored in autumn because she ran warm and did not like to be overheated. Where the sleeve ended at her forearm, just at the edge of the fabric, there was a shadow that I had read as a crease in the material when I first saw the photograph. It was not a crease. It was the upper edge of a bruise, wide enough to be visible even at the resolution of a phone photograph, dark enough that whoever dressed her that morning had chosen 3/4 sleeves specifically and still had not quite managed to cover it completely. My coffee cup was in my hand. I set it down carefully because I did not trust myself to hold it steadily. I told myself it was the lighting," Sandra said, and her voice cracked for the first time. "I looked at it, and I told myself it was a shadow from the geraniums or the angle of the sun or some artifact of the camera, because the alternative was that my niece was standing in front of her house, smiling for a photograph, with a bruise on her arm that someone had tried to hide. And if that was true, then I had looked at that picture and done absolutely nothing. We both did nothing, I said. That stops now. Sandra wiped her eyes once quickly with the back of her hand, and then she was composed again in the way practical women become composed. Not by pushing feeling down, but by deciding that feeling would have to wait for a more convenient moment. There's something else, she said. She reached across to the counter behind her and picked up a small padded envelope, the kind used for mailing documents, with Emily's return address in the upper left corner and Sandra's address written below it in Emily's handwriting. The envelope was still sealed. It came in the mail 4 weeks ago, Sandra said. Emily called me the same day and asked me to hold on to it without opening it. She said she would explain later. Sandra set the envelope on the table between us. She said, and I am quoting her exactly, that she needed someone she trusted to have it, in case she could not speak for herself. I looked at the envelope. Emily's handwriting on the front, careful and deliberate, each letter formed with the kind of attention you give something when you understand it matters. She planned for this, I said. Not a question. She was afraid, Sandra said, for longer than either of us knew, and she was trying to protect herself the only way she could figure out how to do it alone. I reached across the table and picked up the envelope. It was light. Whatever was inside, there was not much of it. But Emily had sealed it and addressed it and mailed it to the one person she trusted, and that meant whatever was inside was exactly what she needed someone to find. I'm going to need to make a phone call after we open this, I said. Sandra nodded. She was already on her feet, moving to the drawer where she kept her scissors. Sandra cut the top edge cleanly and set the scissors back on the counter. She did not hand the envelope to me. She held it out flat on her palm, the way you hold something you are not sure belongs to you, and I took it with both hands. Inside there were 2 things. The first was a folded sheet of notepaper. 3 folds, the kind of careful folding that means someone sat down and thought about what they were doing before they did it. The second was a photograph printed on regular copy paper, the image slightly pixelated from being enlarged beyond its original resolution. I unfolded the notepaper first. Emily's handwriting filled the page from margin to margin, and unlike the careful neutral note Jason had produced that morning, this one looked exactly like my daughter. Words underlined, a sentence crossed out and rewritten above it, a small arrow in the margin pointing to a line she had added as an afterthought. Her capital E open at the top, every single one. She wrote, Dad. If Sandra gave you this, then something has gone wrong, and I could not find another way to tell you. I need you to know that I am not confused, and I am not having a breakdown, and I have not decided to leave. Whatever you have been told, none of that is true. I have been trying to figure out how to get out of this safely for 4 months. I am scared, but I am thinking clearly. I love you. Do not blame yourself for not seeing it sooner. He was very good at making sure no one saw anything he did not want them to see. I read it twice. Then I folded it along the original creases and held it in my left hand while I looked at the photograph with my right. The image showed a phone screen displaying a text message conversation. The contact name at the top had been cropped out, but the messages were legible. One side of the conversation in gray bubbles asked about the status of a transfer and whether the paperwork had been filed before the end of the month. The other side in blue responded, almost done. The second signature is the last piece. Once that clears, we move everything to the holding account before she figures out what the balance actually is. Sandra was reading over my shoulder. I heard her draw a sharp breath through her nose. She took a screenshot and printed it, Sandra said. She must have gotten into his phone when he was sleeping. 4 months ago, I said. She's been collecting this for 4 months and hiding it and planning for someone to find it, and she never said a word to either of us because she was afraid of what he would do if she did. My chest felt like something was sitting on it. Not pain exactly. Weight. The specific weight of understanding that your child was in danger for months while you were going about your ordinary life, and she protected you from knowing it because she was trying to protect you, and the protection went in the wrong direction. I set both items on Sandra's kitchen table and took out my phone. Danny Reeves was the son of my oldest friend Gerald, who had passed 3 years ago from a heart condition that none of us had known about until it was too late. Danny was 38 years old and had spent 11 years as a loan officer and credit analyst at a regional bank before a back injury forced him into early medical leave. He lived 20 minutes away in the same neighborhood where he had grown up, and he understood the architecture of financial documents, the way carpenters understand wood grain intuitively and without having to think about it. I had called Danny twice in the past year. Once when I needed help understanding the terms of a refinancing offer on my own house, and once when Gerald's estate needed a second set of eyes on some paperwork. Both times he had been straightforward and thorough, and had not made me feel foolish for not knowing things he had spent a decade learning professionally. He answered on the third ring. "Robert, it's late. Everything okay?" "No," I said. "I need your help with something, and I need it to be between us for now." A pause. "Tell me what you have." I described the screenshot as accurately as I could. The language about the second signature, the holding account, the timeline pressure around the end of the month. Danny listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a silence on the line that had a specific quality to it. The silence of someone who recognizes what they are hearing and is deciding how to say so. "Robert," he said finally, "can you bring me the original paperwork, bank statements, any account documents you can access, anything with Emily's name on it?" "I can get into her filing cabinet," I said. "She gave me a spare key to the house 2 years ago for emergencies." That qualifies," Danny said. "Come tomorrow morning, and Robert," his voice dropped slightly, "whatever you find in that cabinet, don't move it, don't reorganize it, just bring it exactly as you find it. The order things are in can matter later." "Later meaning legally," I said. "Later meaning legally," he confirmed. After I hung up, Sandra picked up Emily's letter from the table and read it again slowly. When she finished, she set it down and pressed both palms flat on the table and stared at the surface for a long moment. She said, "Do not blame yourself," Sandra said. I know what she said. "Are you going to manage that?" I picked up the photograph of the text messages and looked at the blue bubbles again. "Once that clears, we move everything to the holding account before she figures out what the balance actually is." 4 months. Emily had known for 4 months and carried it alone, mailing evidence to her aunt and leaving voice recordings on broken phones and trying to find a way out that kept everyone safe, including me. "No," I said honestly. "Not yet, but I'll put it aside until there's time for it." Sandra nodded. That was the right answer, and she knew it. "What do you need me to do?" "Keep the letter and the photograph somewhere safe," I said, "and be available tomorrow. I have a feeling tomorrow is going to be a long day." I drove home in the dark, with the weight still sitting on my chest, and Maggie's porch light burning across the street, and the knowledge that somewhere my daughter was waiting for me to figure out the next move. I did not intend to disappoint her twice. I arrived at Emily's house at 7:15 in the morning, when the street was still quiet, and Jason's car was not in the driveway. I did not know where he was, and I did not want to know. I used the spare key Emily had given me 2 years ago after her knee surgery, when she said she needed someone reliable to have access in case something happened. I had kept it on a hook by my back door ever since, between the key to the garden shed and the key to Margaret's old jewelry box, and I had never once imagined I would use it the way I used it that morning. The house felt different, empty. Houses do that. They take on the character of whoever is absent rather than whoever is present. And what I felt walking through Emily's front door was the specific absence of my daughter. Her particular way of arranging a room, the small yellow notepad she kept on the kitchen counter for grocery lists, the reading glasses she was always setting down and forgetting. The notepad was gone. The glasses were gone. The surface of the counter was wiped clean in a way Emily never bothered with on an ordinary morning. Jason had been tidying. That told me something. I found the filing cabinet in the small room off the hallway that Emily used as a home office. It was a 2-drawer steel cabinet, unlocked, organized in the careful way Emily organized everything she considered important. I did not rearrange anything. I lifted the hanging folders out in order exactly as Danny had instructed and placed them flat in the cardboard box I had brought from home. I was in and out in 11 minutes. I did not touch anything else. Danny's kitchen table was covered in papers by 9 o'clock. He worked methodically, moving from folder to folder with a yellow legal pad beside him, writing notes in a small, precise hand that reminded me of an accountant I had worked with 30 years ago, who could find an error in a column of figures the way other people find a familiar face in a crowd. Danny had that same quality of attention, unhurried and absolute. I sat across from him and drank the coffee he had made, and did not interrupt. After 40 minutes, he set his pen down and looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "Okay," he said. "I'm going to walk you through what I'm seeing, and I need you to tell me if any of this surprises you." "Go ahead," I said. "I'm starting with the joint checking account." He turned the legal pad so I could see his notes. "There have been 6 withdrawals over the past 8 months, totaling $180,000. Each withdrawal was made at a branch location, not an ATM, which means someone appeared in person with identification. The withdrawal slips all carry Emily's signature, but look at the pressure pattern." He held up 2 documents side by side. "Her signature on the account opening form from 4 years ago has inconsistent pressure. Real handwriting does. These withdrawal signatures are all identical. Same pressure, same angle, same loop on the Y. Nobody signs their name the same way 6 times in a row unless they are copying." My coffee cup was halfway to my mouth. I put it back down. "The car," Danny continued. "The title transfer on Emily's Subaru was processed through a notary office in Placer County. I know that office. They had their license suspended 8 months ago for irregularities in their documentation process." He paused to let that settle. "The transfer went through anyway because the suspension was processed after the filing date, but the notarization itself would not hold up to scrutiny." "What about the house?" I asked. The house was the thing I was most afraid of. Emily's mother and I had purchased that property and put it in Emily's name as her wedding gift, free and clear, no mortgage. Danny picked up a thick folder and opened it to a tabbed page. "The house is why I asked you to come in person rather than talking on the phone." He set the document in front of me. It was a mortgage application, the kind of standardized form used by conventional lenders, running to 11 pages. Emily's name was on the first page. Her signature was on the last. This application was submitted to a private lending company called Westbridge Capital Group 6 months ago. The loan amount requested was $320,000 secured against the property value. He pointed to the signature line. "California is a community property state. That means both spouses must sign any document that encumbers a jointly held asset. Emily's signature is here. There is no second signature line and no acknowledgement that the lender verified spousal consent." "Because the lender didn't verify it," I said. "Because someone at the lender helped make sure it didn't need to be verified," Danny said. He said it quietly, the way you say something when you want it to land without drama. Robert, this is not disorganized opportunism. This was planned. The withdrawal pattern, the notary, the lending company, the timeline. Whoever did this understood how financial systems process paperwork and where the gaps are. I looked at the mortgage document for a long time. $320,000 borrowed against the house. Margaret and I had given our daughter as a gift, using a signature that was not hers, processed through a lender that apparently had reasons not to ask too many questions. Danny picked up one more document and held it across the table. This came in a separate folder at the back of the second drawer, he said. I almost missed it. It was an insurance policy. The insured party was Emily. The coverage amount was $500,000. The policy had been purchased 2 months ago. The primary beneficiary line read Jason Matthew Holt. The secondary beneficiary line read Richard and Donna Holt, his parents. He bought this 2 months ago, I said. 2 months ago, Danny confirmed. He took his glasses off and set them on the table. Robert, I think you need a lawyer. Not tomorrow. Today. I drove home from Danny's with the insurance document folded in my jacket pocket, and the particular feeling of a man who has just learned that the ground he has been standing on was never as solid as he believed. There was a manila envelope on my kitchen counter that I had been avoiding for 3 weeks. Jason had brought it on a Tuesday morning, appearing at my door with the same practiced concern he had displayed every time he wanted something from me, and he had set it on the counter and explained it quickly. The way you explain things to someone you have already decided will not ask too many questions. He said it was a formal missing persons support document. He said California had a process for family members to designate a coordinator when an adult went missing, someone who could interface with financial institutions and service providers on behalf of the absent person. He said he had already signed his portion and just needed my signature as Emily's next of kin to complete the filing. I had looked at the document for approximately 45 seconds. It was long, densely printed, the kind of legal language that is designed to be thorough enough to look legitimate and complicated enough to discourage careful reading. Jason had already tabbed the signature line with a yellow sticky arrow. I signed where he pointed. He thanked me, took the document, and left. I had not thought about it again until Danny said the words, holding account. Now I stood at my kitchen counter and looked at the copy Jason had left behind. The second copy, the one he said was for my records, and I read it the way I should have read it 3 weeks ago. Word by word. Paragraph by paragraph. Stopping at every phrase I did not immediately understand and reading it again until I did. It took me 35 minutes. By the end, my reading glasses had fogged, and I had to take them off and press the back of my hand against my mouth and stand very still for a moment before I could trust myself to continue thinking clearly. The document was not a missing person support filing. It was a durable power of attorney that Jason had disguised as a routine family assistance form. The document appeared to give him broad authority over Emily's financial affairs, but Patricia later explained that a power of attorney obtained through deception or misrepresentation could be challenged and revoked through the proper legal process. Jason had not gained control because the document was legitimate. He had gained leverage because he had convinced people to trust a document they did not understand. The notary stamp at the bottom bore a name I did not recognize and a commission number I had not thought to verify. Danny had warned me about the notary office in Placer County. I photographed the stamp on Jason's document and sent the image to Danny with a single question. He responded in 4 minutes. Different name, same pattern. He would check the commission number in the morning. I sat down at the kitchen table where I had sat 3 weeks ago and signed my daughter's life over to the man who was holding her somewhere I did not yet know. The power of attorney under California law is one of the most powerful legal instruments a person can execute. It allows the designated agent to act with the full legal authority of the principal in virtually every financial and contractual matter. A durable version, which this was, remains effective even if the principal becomes incapacitated. What Jason held in his hands was on paper the legal right to do everything Danny had described, and more with my signature as the family witness, lending it an additional layer of apparent legitimacy. He had not forged this one. He had simply explained it incorrectly to a 68-year-old man who trusted him because Emily had chosen him, and trust extended by love is the hardest kind to examine critically. I called Danny back. "The POA," I said when he answered. "Can it be revoked?" "Yes," Danny said immediately, which told me he had already been thinking about it. Emily can revoke it herself by executing a written revocation before a licensed notary and delivering it to any institution where Jason has attempted to use the document. You can also contest it on the grounds that it was obtained by fraud or misrepresentation, which, given what we have, is supportable. He paused. "But Robert, to do any of that, you need Emily to be present and coherent and in a safe location. The revocation has to come from her or from an attorney acting on documented evidence of fraud. So first I find Emily," I said. "First you find Emily," Danny said. "Everything else follows from that." After I hung up, I sat with the document in front of me and thought about the 71 days remaining before the 90-day threshold Jason had built into the language. 90 days of Emily being absent and unaccounted for, and on the 91st day, the document's secondary provisions allowed Jason to petition a probate court to formalize his authority over her estate on the grounds of extended incapacitation. He had not left anything to chance. He had built himself a legal clock and set it running the morning he drove Emily away, and then he had come to my house and handed me the winding key, and I had used it without understanding what I was holding. I folded the document carefully and placed it in the box with the other papers from Danny's table. Then I picked up my phone and called the number on the card that Danny had texted me an hour earlier. The card belonged to a family law and elder fraud attorney named Patricia Harmon, whom Danny described as the sharpest person he knew in situations where financial misconduct and family relationships overlapped. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was direct and unhurried. "Mr. Callahan," she said after I introduced myself and Danny's name. "Tell me everything and don't leave anything out because you think it makes you look bad. The parts that make you look bad are usually the most important ones." I took a breath and started at the beginning. Patricia Harmon's office was on the 4th floor of a building on J Street in downtown Sacramento, the kind of office that communicated competence without trying to impress anyone. Bookshelves organized by subject rather than color, a desk clear of everything except what was actively being worked on a single window overlooking the street below. She was 53 years old, with the kind of face that had decided somewhere along the way that it was not interested in performing warmth. It did not feel, which I found reassuring rather than cold. Competent people do not need to charm you. They need to be right. I had spent 2 hours with her the previous evening and left with 3 things: a clear understanding of what Jason had done and what could be proven, a list of documents she needed me to gather, and the knowledge that finding Emily was not just a personal priority, but a legal one, because without Emily present and able to speak for herself, every action Patricia could take moved more slowly and with more friction. I left her office at 11 in the morning and drove toward home on autopilot, the way you drive roads you have traveled 10,000 times, your hands knowing the turns before your mind decides to make them. I stopped at the coffee shop on Freeport Boulevard where I had gone every Tuesday morning for 14 years before Margaret died, and the Tuesdays started running together. The woman at the corner table looked up when I walked in. I did not know her. She was perhaps 50, with dark hair pulled back and the careful stillness of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible in public places. She looked at me the way strangers sometimes look at you, when you remind them of someone they know, a quick, uncertain recognition, and then her eyes dropped to my jacket pocket, where I had set my phone face up on the table before I sat down. Emily's contact photo was visible on the screen. I had pulled it up during the drive and not put the phone away. The woman's face changed, not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes, a particular quality of attention that was different from casual curiosity. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was careful. "Is that your daughter?" I looked at the phone screen and then back at her. "Yes." "Is she married to a man named Jason Holt?" My coffee was in my hand. I set it down on the table between us. "Who are you?" She introduced herself as Carol Simmons. She said it the way people say their name when they are not sure how it will be received, braced for a reaction. She had been married to Jason for 14 months, 7 years ago in Phoenix, Arizona. The marriage ended when Jason sat across from her at their kitchen table one evening and slid a manila folder across the surface and told her very calmly that the folder contained documentation that would be deeply damaging to her professional reputation if it became public, and that she had 2 options. She could make the process of their divorce as simple and undisputed as possible, signing whatever he put in front of her without involving attorneys, or she could contest it and find out how the documents felt in the hands of her employer and her family. "What was in the folder?" I asked. Carol wrapped both hands around her mug. "Some of it was real. Financial records from a period in my life I was not proud of a few years before I met him, when I made some poor decisions and accumulated debt I was not honest about with people who trusted me. He found it somehow, I never knew how. The rest was fabricated. Letters, account statements, things that looked official but weren't." She met my eyes steadily. The combination was enough. If I had tried to fight it, the real parts would have been enough to embarrass me badly, and I could not afford to spend the time and money separating the real from the false in a public proceeding. "So you left," I said. "I left, and I told myself I was protecting myself, and that was a reasonable thing to do." Her jaw tightened. "I have told myself that approximately 10,000 times in 7 years, and it has never once felt true." I asked her why she had not come forward. She said 2 things. The first was that she had no proof Jason had done anything illegal. She had signed documents voluntarily. He had never raised his voice or made a physical threat. Everything he did existed in a space that was frightening and coercive without being easy to name in a police report. The second was that she was afraid. Simply and honestly afraid, in the way people are afraid of someone who has demonstrated they know exactly which pressure points to use. But you recognized my daughter's photograph," I said. "I recognized the look on her face in this picture on your phone," Carol said. "Not fear. Something past fear. The place you get to after you have been afraid long enough that it starts to feel normal." She paused. "I had that look for about 8 months. I forgot what my face felt like without it." I told her what had happened. Not everything, but enough. Emily's call, the phone in the trash can, the financial documents, the power of attorney. Carol listened without interrupting, and when I finished, her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears and not quite anger, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "I will give you a written statement," she said. "Whatever your attorney needs. I should have done something years ago, and I did not. And I understand that I cannot undo that, but I can be useful to you now if you will let me." I took Patricia Harmon's card from my pocket and slid it across the table. Carol picked it up and held it in both hands. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Maggie, 3 words long. Come home now. I left $2 on the table for the coffee I had not finished and drove back to my neighborhood in 11 minutes, which was 4 minutes faster than the route normally allowed. Maggie was standing on her porch when I pulled into my driveway, wearing her gardening coat and holding something in her right hand with the careful grip of a person who has decided the thing they are holding matters. She crossed the street before I reached my front steps. "I should have given you this days ago," she said, and pressed a small envelope into my hand. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing. I told myself that right up until this morning when I woke up at 4 o'clock and could not go back to sleep. Because I kept seeing Emily's face at Christmas dinner 2 years ago when she laughed so hard at your joke about the turkey that she spilled eggnog on Jason's sleeve. Maggie's voice tightened. She does not strike me as a woman who simply walks away from her life. I should have trusted that instinct from the first day. The envelope was the standard white kind, slightly wrinkled at one corner from being handled. Inside was a single receipt, printed on thermal paper, of the type used by older point-of-sale systems already fading at the edges. Pine Ridge Motor Inn. Route 9, Carmichael. 1 room paid in cash, 7 nights check-in date, February 28th. The same date Emily disappeared. I read the receipt twice, standing on my front walk with Maggie watching my face the way people watch a face when they are trying to determine how much damage has been done. "Where did you find this?" I asked. "Emily's mailbox," Maggie said. "She asked me 3 months ago to collect her mail on days when Jason was traveling for work. She said he sometimes forgot to bring it in, and she did not like important things sitting out." Maggie pressed her lips together. "I found this receipt in a stack of envelopes 2 weeks ago. It was addressed to Jason. Return address was a P.O. box I did not recognize. It had already been opened and reinserted like someone read it and put it back." She paused. "I thought about putting it back in the box. Then I thought about Emily, and I put it in my pocket instead." I thanked her in a way that I hoped communicated what I actually meant, which was more than the word was built to carry. Then I went inside and called Danny. "Pine Ridge Motor Inn on Route 9 in Carmichael," I said when he answered. "I need whatever you can find about the owner or operator." Danny called back in 22 minutes. The property was registered to a sole proprietor named Victor Hales, 64 years old, residing at an address in Rancho Cordova. Victor had operated Pine Ridge Motor Inn for 11 years. His business license had been flagged 18 months ago by Sacramento County for a zoning irregularity related to an unpermitted storage structure on the property. The flag had not resulted in formal action, but remained open in the county database, which meant Victor Hales was a man with an unresolved official matter sitting over his head, like a low ceiling he had learned to duck under every morning. "He's exposed," Danny said. "Not criminally, not in any serious way, but enough that an official inquiry into his business practices would be uncomfortable for him." "That's enough," I said. I drove out to Route 9 at 6 in the evening, later than I had planned, because a late winter storm had moved in from the north while I was on the phone with Danny and turned the last hour of daylight into something gray and pressing. The rain was not heavy, but it was steady, the kind that does not announce itself dramatically and simply settles in for the duration. And by the time I reached the county road, the windshield wipers were working steadily, and the headlights were catching the rain in thin, silver lines. I had driven further in worse conditions, and I did not slow down. The address on the receipt had been sitting in my jacket pocket since Maggie handed it to me, and the distance between me and that address was the only thing I was interested in reducing. Pine Ridge Motor Inn sat back from the road behind a gravel lot, a single-story structure in the shape of a shallow L-12 rooms, the kind of property that had been respectable once and was now surviving on the momentum of its earlier reputation. The vacancy sign in the office window had a burned-out letter so that it read, Vacancy, in uneven red light blurred slightly by the rain on my windshield as I pulled in. I parked and went into the office. Victor Hales was behind the counter, a broad man going soft at the edges with the particular expression of someone who has spent too many years behind a counter, watching people come in with problems that were not his problems until they became his problems. He looked at me the way he probably looked at everyone assessing the nature of the difficulty before committing to a response. "Help you," he said. I set the receipt on the counter between us. He looked at it without touching it. "I'm looking for information about this reservation," I said. "The person who paid for this room is connected to my daughter's disappearance. I am not here to cause trouble for your business. I am here because my daughter is 68 days from losing everything she owns, and I believe she may have been brought to this property against her will." Victor's expression did not change exactly, but something shifted behind it. "I don't discuss guests," he said. "I understand that," I said. I reached into my jacket and set Danny's business card on the counter beside the receipt. Then I set Patricia Harmon's card beside that one. "Those are the people I am working with. The first is a financial analyst. The second is an attorney who specializes in fraud cases." I looked at him steadily. "I understand that you cannot discuss guests without proper authorization. My attorney is preparing the necessary requests and investigators may need your cooperation. I am not asking you to break any rules. I am asking you to understand that my daughter may be in danger, and any information you can legally provide could help bring her home safely. That is simply how it works." Victor Hales looked at the two cards for a long moment. Victor looked at the cards for a long moment. Then he slowly reached beneath the counter and pulled out a printed reservation record. "I cannot give you access to the room," he said, "but I can tell you this. A man paid cash, requested complete privacy, and specifically told me not to disturb the guest. If law enforcement or your attorney contacts me, I will cooperate." "Room 12, he said. "End of the left corridor. I don't know anything about how she got here or who brought her. A man paid cash and asked me not to disturb the room. I thought it was a personal matter." His voice had gone flat in a way that sounded like a man beginning to understand the dimensions of what he had agreed to. "I thought it was a personal matter," he said again, quieter this time, as though repeating it might make it more true than it felt. I took the key from the counter and walked toward the corridor. The corridor was narrow and poorly lit, the kind of lighting that exists not to illuminate, but simply to prove that the lights are on. The carpet runner down the center had a pattern that might have been burgundy once, and was now the color of something that had given up. 6 doors on the left side, 6 on the right, all of them closed. At the far end, a red exit sign threw a thin wash of color across the wall. I counted the door numbers as I walked. 7, 8, 9. My footsteps made no sound on the carpet. 10, 11. The key was in my right hand, and I was aware of my own breathing in a way I had not been aware of it since the morning Margaret's doctor called and used the word metastatic for the first time. 12. I stopped in front of the door and looked at it for a moment. Plain hollow core construction, the kind used in budget properties everywhere, a brass number screwed slightly crooked into the surface. Nothing distinguished it from the 11 doors I had passed. Whatever was on the other side of it had been on the other side of it for 5 days, and I had been 12 miles away, reading the wrong documents and trusting the wrong people, and waiting for something that turned out to be a key on a metal ring handed over by a man who thought it was a personal matter. I put the key in the lock and turned it. The room was dark, except for the light coming through a gap in the curtains, a single vertical stripe of parking lot illumination that fell across the middle of the floor. I reached inside the door frame and found the light switch. The overhead bulb came on the cheap, flickering kind that takes 2 seconds to decide it is going to work. And in those 2 seconds, I heard something. A sound from the far side of the bed. Small and careful. The sound a person makes when they have learned that sounds can have consequences. "Emily," I said. A pause that lasted less than a second, but felt considerably longer. "Dad." She was on the floor between the bed and the wall, her back against the baseboard, and her knees drawn up to her chest. She was wearing the same clothes she had been wearing in the last photograph Jason had posted, the light blue cardigan and dark jeans, except the cardigan had a tear along the left shoulder seam, and the jeans were dirty at the knees. Her hair was loose and uncombed. She had lost weight in 5 days in the way people lose weight when they are not eating because they are too frightened to feel hungry. She looked at me the way you look at something you have been hoping for so long that you have started to believe it is not coming. I crossed the room and lowered myself to the floor beside her, my knees protesting the way they always did, and I put my arm around her shoulders. She was cold through the fabric of the cardigan. She leaned into me the way she used to lean when she was 7 years old and had a nightmare, and came to find me in the dark, not dramatically, not collapsing, just shifting her weight toward mine, as though proximity was the thing she had been missing most. "You found me?" she said. Her voice was rough from disuse. "I found you," I said. We sat there on the floor for a moment, and I felt her rib cage expand and contract against my arm, and I thought about the 18 seconds of audio on the broken phone, and the receipt in Maggie's pocket, and the yellow legal pad on Danny's kitchen table, and every document in the box I had carried out of her filing cabinet, and I understood that all of it had been pointing here to this specific patch of cheap carpet in room 12 of a motor inn on Route 9 to my daughter, sitting on the floor, because she had run out of other places to be. "Can you stand?" I asked. "Yes." She pushed herself up carefully, and I stood with her, and I saw her left arm when the cardigan sleeve shifted. The bruise had spread and deepened in 5 days, a wide, irregular shape above the wrist that had gone from purple to the dark greenish yellow of something in its later stages. She pulled the sleeve down when she noticed me looking. "It doesn't hurt much anymore," she said. "Okay," I said, because arguing about it in room 12 of the Pine Ridge Motor Inn was not the right use of the next 10 minutes. I helped her gather what was in the room, which was very little. A travel bag with a change of clothes that someone had packed for her. Her wallet emptied of cash, but still containing her driver's license and 1 credit card. A paperback book face down on the nightstand, a library copy with a due date 3 weeks past. She picked it up and held it against her chest, the way people hold objects when they need something solid. I called Sandra from the parking lot, while Emily stood beside the car and looked up at the sky the way people look at open space when they have been without it. "I have her," I said when Sandra answered. "She's safe. We're coming to you." Sandra made a sound on the other end of the line that was not a word. Then she said, "I'll have food ready. Drive carefully." In the car, Emily sat with her hands folded in her lap and the paperback on the seat beside her. She did not speak for the first 3 minutes. I did not push her. Then she turned toward me with the particular expression of someone preparing to say something they have been organizing for a long time. "Dad," she said, and the way she said it carried something different from the ordinary word, deliberate and weighted the way she spoke. When she wanted me to understand, she was being completely serious. Margaret had taught her that the same word in different voices could mean entirely different things. "How much do you already know?" "Enough," I said. "Tell me the rest when you are ready." She nodded. Outside the window, Sacramento moved past in its ordinary Friday evening way, people driving home from work, restaurants, filling up the world, conducting its business as though nothing had happened. I kept both hands on the wheel and drove toward Sandra's house, and did not look at the clock, because for the first time in 5 days I was not racing anything. Sandra had the porch light on when we pulled up, and the front door open before I cut the engine, and a look on her face that I recognized from 30 years of watching her navigate difficult things, the particular steadiness of a woman who has decided that falling apart is a luxury she cannot currently afford. Emily stepped out of the car, and Sandra crossed the porch in 4 steps and put both arms around her niece without saying anything, and Emily's hands came up slowly and gripped the back of Sandra's sweater, and they stood like that in the yellow porch light for a long moment, while I got out of the car and looked at the street and gave them the privacy of my back. Inside, Sandra had made soup, tomato from a can, the way Emily had liked it since she was a child, because Sandra remembered things like that. Emily sat at the kitchen table with both hands around the bowl and ate with the focused attention of someone relearning a basic skill. I sat across from her. Sandra sat at the end of the table and did not speak and did not leave. When the bowl was empty, Emily set it aside and folded her hands on the table and looked at me. "I want to tell you everything," she said. "I've been rehearsing it in that room for 5 days. I need to say it out loud to someone who can do something with it." "I'm listening," I said. She started 8 months earlier, which was further back than I had expected. Jason had begun shifting money out of their joint account the previous July, small amounts, at first 2,000 here, 3,500. There were transactions, she noticed, but accepted his explanations for. A vendor payment, a deposit on a work trip, a reimbursement he was owed. He explained everything in the tone of a man who found the question slightly tedious, and she had learned over 2 years of marriage that questioning that tone produced a version of Jason she did not enjoy being around. "I kept a notebook," Emily said, "in the back of my closet inside a winter boot. Dates and amounts. I started keeping it in September when I realized the explanations had stopped matching the numbers." She pressed her thumb against the handle of her soup spoon. "He found it in November. He came into the kitchen with it in his hand, and he set it on the counter in front of me, and he looked at me for a long time without saying anything. And that was the moment I understood that I had been thinking about the situation incorrectly." "What do you mean?" Sandra asked. "I had been thinking about it as a financial problem," Emily said. "A problem I could document and address and eventually resolve by confronting him with evidence. That look told me it was not a financial problem. The notebook frightened him. A frightened Jason was a different thing than an angry one." She raised her eyes to mine. "I started planning the next day. How to get evidence out of the house, who to send it to, how to find a way to leave that did not give him time to react." She told me about the screenshots. She had taken them over 6 weeks, small opportunities, when Jason left his phone on the charger and went to shower or walked out to check the mail. She photographed what she could and airdropped the files to a secondary email account she had created on a library computer, so there was no trace of it on any device Jason could access. She told me about the phone she had bought with cash from a drugstore on a Tuesday afternoon when Jason thought she was at a dentist appointment. Prepaid Anonymous kept in the lining of a tote bag she carried everywhere because it held her gym shoes, and Jason had never once shown interest in gym shoes. "The 3 in the morning messages," I said. Emily looked up. Her eyes filled not with tears exactly, but with the particular brightness of someone who has just had a private pain acknowledged out loud for the first time. "You found those," she said. "I found them. I did not know they were from you until it was too late to answer." She nodded slowly. "I could only use the phone when I was sure he was deeply asleep. I set an alarm in my head the way you can sometimes do, and I would wake up at 3 and check, and if he was breathing the right way, I would send you whatever I could manage without typing for long enough to wake him." Her voice dropped. "I never sent anything important. I was afraid to. I just wanted you to know I was there. I thought if something happened to me and you looked back at your phone, you would at least know I had been trying to reach you." I pressed my knuckles against my mouth and looked at the table and breathed carefully for a moment. "The night he took you to Pine Ridge," Sandra said gently. "Can you tell us about that?" Emily straightened her shoulders. "We had dinner at home. He had cooked, which he rarely did, and he was pleasant all evening in the way he is pleasant when he has already decided something. After dinner, he told me he had made arrangements for me to stay somewhere quiet for a few weeks. He said I had been under a lot of stress, and a change of environment would help." Her jaw tightened. I asked him where. He said a friend's property. I asked to see my phone. He said he had already packed it with my things. When I went to the front door, my bag was already there. She looked at her hands. I got as far as the car before I understood that asking questions was not going to be productive. I had the prepaid phone in the lining of my tote bag. While he was loading the car, I sent you the call. I managed 11 seconds before he came back. She paused. He took the tote bag at the motel. He said he would keep it safe. I think he found the phone the next morning. He left before I woke up, and I never saw either one again. She looked up at me then, directly in the way she had looked at me, since she was old enough to understand that I was the kind of parent who preferred directness to comfort. "Dad," she said, "I need you to tell me we are not going to let him walk away from this." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. "No," I said, "we are not." Sandra stood up and started clearing the table with the brisk efficiency of a woman who processes emotion through motion. And I stayed where I was, with my hand over Emily's, and thought about everything Patricia Harmon had told me, and everything Danny had documented, and everything that still needed to happen before Jason Holt understood the full dimensions of what he had miscalculated. He had built his plan around the certainty that I was an old man who would accept a convenient explanation. That was his only real mistake. But it was enough. I did not sleep that night. Not because I was frightened, but because there was too much to organize and my mind had shifted into the mode it used to enter before large contract negotiations, a state of cold, methodical clarity that Margaret used to call my accountant face, and did not particularly enjoy being on the receiving end of. Emily was asleep in Sandra's guest room by 10 o'clock, which the doctor Sandra called said was the best thing for her. Sandra sat with me at the kitchen table until past midnight, and we talked through what we had and what we still needed, and what the sequence of events had to be if we wanted the outcome to hold, rather than collapse under the weight of its own urgency. The problem was simple to state and complicated to solve. We had documents. We had Danny's analysis. We had Carol Simmons's willingness to provide a written statement. We had Patricia Harmon working on the legal architecture. What we did not yet have was something that placed Jason's own words on record, something that could not be reframed as misunderstanding or misinterpretation, or the selective memory of a family in conflict. Patricia had been clear about this when I called her from Sandra's kitchen at 11 that night. "Paper trails are essential," she said, "but a sophisticated defense attorney will spend considerable energy arguing about intent. What closes that door is direct evidence of knowing participation. Something in Jason's own voice or writing that demonstrates he understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway." "How do we get that?" I asked. "Carefully," she said, "and with professional help." Tom Garrett had been a licensed private investigator in Sacramento County for 19 years. Danny had worked with him twice on fraud cases during his banking years, and described him as a man who understood the precise boundary between evidence gathering and entrapment and never crossed it. Not because he was timid, but because he understood that evidence collected outside that boundary was evidence a defense attorney could discard. I called Tom at 7 the next morning. He came to Sandra's house at 9, a compact man in his early 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the unhurried manner of someone who had heard most varieties of difficult story and had learned that patience at the beginning saved considerable time at the end. I laid out everything on Sandra's kitchen table. The documents, Danny's notes, the recording from Emily's phone, the receipt from Pine Ridge, Carol's statement which Patricia had already received and formatted into a sworn declaration. Tom listened without interrupting and made 3 pages of notes in a small spiral notebook. When I finished, he looked at his notes for a moment and then looked at me. "The financial documentation is strong," he said. "The forgery evidence is strong. What you need now is something that demonstrates Jason believes the plan is still viable, that he has not yet understood that you know what you know." He tapped his pen against the notebook. "The most effective approach is to give him a reason to confirm his intentions in writing. People who believe they are communicating with a confederate are considerably less careful than people who believe they are being observed." "A confederate," I said. "Someone who appears to know about Pine Ridge and wants compensation for their silence. Jason has a financial problem and he has a timeline. A person in that position tends to respond to a blackmail approach by trying to manage it rather than report it, because reporting it requires explaining how the situation arose in the first place." Tom met my eyes. "This is a civil evidence-gathering operation, Mr. Callahan, not a criminal sting. I will structure it, document it, and ensure that nothing we do constitutes an illegal threat or coercion. The messages will be factual in nature and will not demand money under threat of harm. What they will do is create an opportunity for Jason to confirm his own plan in his own words." I thought about it for 30 seconds. Then I said yes. But first I had to see Jason. I had to make him believe I had surrendered, because a Jason who suspected something was a Jason who would go quiet and careful and give us nothing. I called him at 10 that morning. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been watching for my name. "Robert," he said with the particular warmth of a man who has just received good news he was not expecting. "I'm so glad you called. I've been thinking about you." "I've been thinking too," I said. I kept my voice level and slightly tired, which was not difficult, because I was tired. "I think I owe you an apology. I've been making this harder than it needs to be." A pause. Barely a second, but I heard it. The recalibration. "You don't owe me anything," he said softer now. "You were worried about Emily. That's completely understandable." "I've been going over things," I said. "You know her better than I do at this point. You've been with her every day. If you say she needed space, I think I have to accept that." I let the sentence sit for a moment. I'm not going to keep pushing. It's not helping anyone. The silence this time was different. Fuller. The silence of a man deciding whether to believe something he very much wants to be true. "That means a lot to me, Robert," Jason said. "Genuinely. I know this has been painful for you. I want you to know that when Emily is ready to come back, I'm going to make sure she gets the help she needs. We're going to be okay. All of us." He said all of us with a confidence that told me he was already spending money that was not yet his. "I appreciate that," I said. "Take care of yourself, Jason." I ended the call and set the phone on Sandra's counter and looked at Tom, who had been sitting across the table listening on a small recorder with my prior consent noted at the start of the recording. He believed it, Tom said. It was not a question. He wanted to believe it, I said. That's the same thing for now. Tom opened his laptop and pulled up a blank document. Then let's write the first message. Tom worked the way surgeons work, precisely, and without visible emotion, each decision made on the basis of what the situation required, rather than what felt satisfying. He had spent 19 years watching people in financial distress make choices they would not have made under ordinary conditions, and he understood something that I was still learning, that desperation does not make people irrational. It makes them rational about the wrong things. Jason was not going to panic. He was going to calculate. Our job was to make sure his calculations led him somewhere useful to us. The first message went out on a Monday evening from a prepaid number Tom had purchased that morning. It was 6 sentences long. It identified the sender as someone who had been at Pine Ridge Motor Inn during the relevant dates and had observed certain things. It did not specify what those things were. It said only that the sender understood the general shape of the situation and believed that a conversation might be mutually beneficial. It closed with a dollar figure. $50,000, which Tom had selected because it was large enough to be taken seriously and small enough to be within Jason's current liquid reach, based on Danny's analysis of the accounts. We waited. Jason read the message within 4 minutes. Tom's software showed the delivery and read receipts in real time, a feature of the messaging platform that Jason apparently did not know about or did not think to account for. He did not respond for 6 hours. When he did, his reply was 3 words. "Who are you?" Tom typed back, "Someone who was there. Someone who understands timing." Another wait. 11 hours this time. Then, "What do you want?" Tom had drafted the response in advance. "We want what we said. 1 conversation, 1 transfer, and this goes nowhere. You have 72 hours. I sat at Sandra's kitchen table during these exchanges and watched Tom's screen and thought about Jason sitting wherever he was sitting, running the same calculations I would have run in his position, trying to determine whether this was a real threat or a bluff, and whether responding made it more or less manageable. The problem for Jason was that he could not report it to the police without explaining what there was to be silent about, which was exactly the corner Tom had designed the message to put him in. On Wednesday, Jason asked for proof that the sender had something genuine. Tom sent him a photograph. It was an image of the Pine Ridge Motor Inn sign taken from the parking lot on the evening I had gone to find Emily, showing the burned-out letter in the vacancy sign and the timestamp from Tom's camera embedded in the file data. It proved nothing except that someone had been there. But to Jason, whose conscience was filling in the gaps, our message left deliberately empty. It was enough. Thursday morning, Jason wrote, "How do I know this ends after 1 payment?" Tom responded, "You don't. But you know what happens if it doesn't start." That afternoon, Jason sent another message. He had clearly been thinking about the phrasing because it was more careful than his earlier responses, more constructed, the writing of a man trying to say something without quite saying it. He wrote, "I need more time. The situation you're referencing is temporary. Once certain paperwork clears and the property matter resolves, I'll be in a better position. Right now, the liquid assets are committed elsewhere." Tom looked at me across the table. "He just confirmed the property transaction is ongoing," he said, "and that he has liquid assets currently deployed. That is not a man who doesn't know what we're talking about." "Keep going," I said. Tom wrote back, "We're not interested in your timeline. We're interested in ours." Friday morning, Jason transferred $50,000 from an account registered to a business entity called Holt Vehicle Consulting into the account number Tom had provided, which was a monitored holding account established specifically for this purpose under the supervision of Patricia Harmon's office. The transfer cleared at 9:17 in the morning. Tom photographed the confirmation and sent it to Patricia within the minute. But the transfer was not the most important thing Jason did that day. At 11:43 that morning, apparently believing that the payment had secured his position and that he was now negotiating from a place of greater strength, Jason sent an unprompted message. Tom and I were sitting at Sandra's kitchen table when it came through, and Tom read it first, and then he turned the laptop to face me without saying anything, because he understood that some things are better read than heard. Jason had written, "I want to be clear about something. The woman in that room went there voluntarily because she was having emotional difficulties. I made arrangements to give her space. Whatever you think you saw the property situation is a private family financial planning matter that my wife is aware of and has consented to. Once the loan clears, I'll make sure everyone is compensated appropriately. This whole thing will be resolved before the end of the month, and nobody needs to know anything about the details." I read it 3 times. The woman in that room. Not my wife, not Emily, not her name. The woman in that room. "He's trying to create a paper record of her consent," Tom said quietly. "He wants a written confirmation that someone outside the situation accepts his version of events." "He's not going to get it," I said. Tom forwarded the message to Patricia's office with a single line of accompanying text. Then he closed the laptop and looked at me. "We have what we came for," he said. Jason Matthew Holt just put his plan in writing and delivered it to a monitored account. The $50,000 transfer is documented. The confirmation of the property transaction is in his own words. Tom took his reading glasses off and set them on the table. Now we move to the next phase. I looked at the closed laptop and thought about what Patricia had said about direct evidence of knowing participation. Something in Jason's own voice or writing that demonstrates he understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. He had given us 3 paragraphs of it. "Call Danny," I said, "and then call Patricia. I need to make a dinner reservation." The Foster house sat directly across from Emily and Jason's on Camellia Drive, a well-maintained colonial with dark green shutters and a vegetable garden along the south fence that Martin Foster tended with the seriousness of a man who had found in retirement a project worthy of his full attention. I had met Martin and his wife Glenda twice at neighborhood gatherings that Emily had brought me to, the kind of casual outdoor events where you learn someone's name and their profession and the names of their children, and then do not speak again for 8 months. Martin had been an engineer for the county water district for 31 years. Glenda taught elementary school music until her knees made standing for 6 hours a day impractical. Tom had identified them as the most likely source of doorbell footage based on the angle of their front entrance relative to Emily's driveway. We drove to Camellia Drive on a Thursday morning 10 days after Emily had come home to Sandra's house, and I sat in the passenger seat and watched the street approach, and thought about the last time I had driven this route the night I found the phone in the trash can, when I still did not know what I was looking for. Martin answered the door in a canvas work shirt with a smear of potting soil on the left sleeve. He recognized me after a moment and stepped back to let us in, calling for Glenda over his shoulder. Glenda came from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and stopped when she saw my face. People who have known you for even a little while can read something wrong in your expression before you have said a single word. She pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and said, "Sit down," and I did. I explained what had happened to Emily in the way I had learned to explain it over the past 2 weeks, starting with the phone call and moving forward, leaving out nothing that was relevant and not expanding on anything that was not. Martin listened with his arms folded and his jaw set. Glenda set the dish towel on the counter and did not pick it up again. When I finished, Martin looked at Glenda. Something passed between them that did not require words. "We have a doorbell camera," Martin said. "We put it in 3 years ago after someone tried the handles on the cars overnight. I never delete the archive because the storage is automatic and I never thought to turn it off." He stood up. "Come out front." The camera was mounted at eye level beside the front door, a wide-angle model that captured the full width of the street and both neighboring driveways. Martin pulled up the archive on his phone and handed it to Tom, who scrolled back to the date in question and found the timestamp without difficulty. The footage was clear. Better than I had expected from a residential doorbell camera, the image sharp enough in the ambient light of the street lamps to read faces rather than just shapes. At 11:47 in the evening, the front door of Emily's house opened. Jason came out first, moving quickly, glancing up and down the street, in the way a person glances when they want to know who is watching rather than when they are simply checking for traffic. He went back inside. 30 seconds later, he came out again, and this time Emily was with him. She was walking. I want to be precise about that because it matters. She was walking under her own power, and she was upright. But her movements had the quality of someone operating slightly outside themselves, a delay between intention and action that was not natural, a careful placement of each foot that suggested the ground was not entirely trustworthy. Jason had his hand at the small of her back. From a distance, it would have looked like an ordinary couple leaving their house in the evening. The camera was not at a distance. Jason opened the rear door of the car, and Emily got in with the deliberate slowness of someone managing a body that was not fully cooperating. He closed the door and went to the driver's side without looking back at the house. The car backed out of the driveway at 11:51 and drove east on Camellia Drive until the camera lost it. Glenda made a sound beside me that was not a word. Martin took his phone back from Tom and looked at the footage for a moment. "I saw them leave that night," he said. "I was up late reading. I looked out the window when I heard the car." His voice had gone flat in a way I recognized as a man processing the difference between what he had told himself he saw and what he was now understanding he actually saw. "I thought she was tired. I thought he was taking her somewhere to rest." "A reasonable thing to think," I said, because it was. Tom had been recording the playback on his own device with Martin's permission. He packaged the footage with the metadata intact, the timestamp embedded in the file, the camera registration, and address attached, and sent it to Patricia Harmon before we left the Foster driveway. Patricia called back within the hour. She had been in contact with Detective Brenda Walsh of the Sacramento County Financial Crimes Unit for the past week, building the evidentiary picture in the sequence that Walsh had specified, each piece added in the order that supported the legal narrative rather than the emotional one. The doorbell footage was the piece Walsh had been waiting for. "She can move on the warrant application today," Patricia said. "The footage establishes physical evidence of the removal. Combined with the financial documentation, the forged instruments, Carol Simmons's declaration, and the monitored transfer, Walsh has sufficient grounds for an arrest warrant on the felony charges. The warrant will take 24 to 48 hours to process through the duty judge." "And after that," I asked. "After that, we need Jason in a specific location at a specific time," Patricia said. "Somewhere we can control the environment and where his arrest will be witnessed by people whose accounts cannot be dismissed." A pause. "Robert, you mentioned earlier the possibility of a family dinner." I looked at Tom, who was watching me from the passenger seat, with the expression of a man who had been in this business long enough to know when the pieces were about to come together. "I'll make the call tonight," I said. I drove home on streets that felt different than they had 2 weeks ago, the way familiar roads sometimes shift when your understanding of what happened on them changes. Camellia Drive in the dark. a car backing out at 11:51, a man who checked the street before he moved. Jason had been so certain no one was paying attention. He had been so certain I was the kind of father who would accept a convenient explanation and go back to his quiet house and his cold coffee and his untouched glass of water. And wait. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment with the engine running. Across the street, Maggie's porch light was on. It was always on now. She had told me 2 days ago that she left it on deliberately because light across a street was a small thing and small things mattered. I turned off the engine and went inside to make the call. Before I reveal how this confrontation unfolds, drop a 19 in the comments right now, so I know you're still here with me. And please note the following story includes some fictional elements and may not be completely factual. If you prefer not to listen further, feel free to turn off the video right here. I called Jason on a Thursday evening and told him I had been thinking about the property paperwork he had helped me sign, the document he had described as a missing persons support filing, and that I wanted to sit down with the family before making any decisions about next steps. I told him I thought it was time to talk practically about Emily's situation and what it meant for the house. I told him I had spoken with a financial advisor who suggested that formalizing certain arrangements sooner rather than later would protect everyone involved. I used the word everyone carefully. It was the kind of word Jason responded to. He accepted the invitation within the hour. He suggested bringing his own attorney, and I told him that was not necessary for an informal family dinner, that this was just a conversation between people who cared about the same things, and that attorneys had a way of making simple discussions complicated. He accepted that too. Lured by the prospect of the property paperwork moving forward, he was willing to accept conditions he would not have accepted otherwise. Sandra came in the afternoon to help set the table. Maggie brought a pie and stayed because I asked her to. And she was the kind of woman who understood, without being told, why her presence at a table made certain conversations more difficult to derail. Danny sat in the kitchen and drank coffee, and was available if anything needed to be explained quickly and clearly. Tom Garrett was parked on the street in a gray sedan in contact with Detective Walsh, who had the arrest warrant signed and folded in her jacket pocket. Emily was in my home office with the door pulled almost closed. She had been there since 4 in the afternoon. She had asked to be the one to open the door, and I had said yes because it was her right, and I was not going to take it from her. Jason arrived at 6:30, which was 15 minutes early, which told me he was eager in a way he was trying not to show. He wore a charcoal blazer over a light blue shirt and carried a bottle of wine that he set on the counter with the ease of a man who had decided this evening was already going his way. He greeted Sandra with a hug that she accepted without warmth, but without visible hostility, which was exactly what I had asked of her. He shook Danny's hand and said it was good to see him, without appearing to remember that they had met only once before. He took his seat at the table with the relaxed posture of a man who believed the hard part was already behind him. There were 6 of us at the table: Robert, Sandra, Maggie, Danny, 2 cousins from my side of the family whom I had called, because I needed witnesses whose relationship to the events was distant enough to be credible and close enough to matter. Jason looked around the table and smiled with every muscle in his face that was designed for smiling. "It's really good to be here," he said. "I know things have been difficult lately. I want you all to know that I'm committed to getting through this as a family. Emily would want that." He said would as though the tense were already settled. I let him talk for 7 minutes. He was good at it, the measured cadences of a man who had learned that the right pace of speech conveyed sincerity more effectively than the right words. He talked about resilience. He talked about what Emily had meant to all of them. He talked about the future in the abstract way people talk about futures they have already spent. And when he reached the sentence that began with the words, "I just want what is best for everyone," I put my hand on the small Bluetooth speaker in the center of the table and pressed play. The room changed, not loudly, The recording was not loud, but the voice that came out of the speaker was Jason's voice, unmistakably the same measured cadence he had been using 30 seconds earlier, and it was saying words that did not belong in a family dinner. The woman in that room went there voluntarily because she was having emotional difficulties. Once the loan clears, I will make sure everyone is compensated appropriately. This whole thing will be resolved before the end of the month, and nobody needs to know anything about the details. Jason's face did not collapse. I had expected it to collapse, and it did not, which told me something about how deeply the performance had become the person. His expression shifted in a way that was almost too small to see: a tightening at the jaw, a slight change in the quality of his stillness, and then he set both hands flat on the table and looked at me with something I had not seen on him before. Not guilt. Calculation. Even now, calculation. That's been edited, he said. You can manipulate recordings. Anyone can do that with a phone app. What you're doing right now is... The door to my home office opened. Emily walked into the dining room in Sandra's blue cardigan, the one she had borrowed the night I brought her home, and she was carrying a manila folder against her chest. And she looked at Jason the way you look at something you spent a long time being afraid of, and have finally stopped being afraid of, not with anger and not with triumph, but with the steady clarity of a person who has done the work required to arrive at that expression. Honestly. Jason stood up from the table. Emily. His voice dropped into the register he used when he wanted to sound wounded. My God. Where have you been? I have been out of my mind worrying about... Sit down, Jason, she said. He did not sit down. But he stopped moving toward her, which was the important thing. Emily set the folder on the table. Inside were the bank records, the forged mortgage documents, the insurance policy with his name on the beneficiary line, the key to room 12 of the Pine Ridge Motor Inn. She laid them out one by one while everyone at the table watched, and Jason stood at the other end of the room and said nothing that helped him. I stood and walked to the front door and opened it. Detective Brenda Walsh stepped inside, followed by a second officer. She looked at Jason with the professional neutrality of someone who has already made all the relevant decisions and is simply here to execute them. Mr. Holt, she said, I have a warrant for your arrest. They took Jason out through my front door at 6:54 in the evening. I know the exact time because I looked at the clock on the microwave when I heard the door close behind them, the same automatic glance I had made 1,000 times in this kitchen, checking the time, the way people check the time when they need something ordinary to hold on to. 6:54. Outside the street was quiet in the way residential streets go quiet on weekday evenings when the workday is done and dinner is over and the neighborhood has settled into itself. A car passed. A dog barked twice and stopped. The patrol vehicle pulled away from the curb and its taillights moved east on my street and disappeared. I stood at the kitchen window and watched until there was nothing left to watch. Behind me, Sandra was clearing the table with the focused efficiency she brought to difficult moments. Maggie had her hand on Emily's shoulder at the far end of the room, talking to her in the low, steady voice she used with her grandchildren when they needed to be reminded that the world was still fundamentally navigable. Danny sat in the corner chair with his reading glasses on, going through a set of documents Patricia had sent through, while the arrest was still happening, because Danny processed stress by finding the next problem that needed solving and solving it. Emily was the still point in all of it. She sat at the table with her hands folded in front of her, and the empty manila folder beside her, and the expression of someone who has just put down something very heavy and is still feeling the shape of it in their arms. I crossed the room and sat down beside her. "How are you doing?" I asked. She considered the question seriously, the way she had considered questions seriously since she was 4 years old, and I had learned not to ask her anything I did not actually want a careful answer to. I feel like I've been holding my breath for 8 months, she said. I think I'm starting to remember how to breathe normally. It's an odd sensation. Detective Walsh came back through the front door 10 minutes later alone and accepted the cup of coffee Sandra offered her with the directness of a woman who had given up false politeness sometime in her first year on the job. She sat at the table across from Emily and me and opened her notebook. I want to give you both an update on where things stand, she said. First, Marcus Webb was taken into custody at his workplace at 5:47 this evening, approximately 1 hour before we executed the warrant here. Mr. Webb is a senior loan processor at Westbridge Capital Group, the private lending company that handled the mortgage application on your property. She looked at Emily. Mr. Webb has been cooperating fully since his arrest. He has provided investigators with documentation of his communications with Jason Holt, going back 14 months, including electronic messages directing him to approve the mortgage application without standard spousal verification procedures, and to flag the account in a way that would delay any automated fraud alerts. Emily pressed her thumb against the edge of the table. Her voice was level when she spoke. He helped Jason do all of this from inside the bank. He facilitated the mortgage fraud and suppressed the fraud detection protocols that should have flagged the application, Walsh said. He has also provided account access records showing a series of payments from Jason Holt's personal accounts to a private account in Mr. Webb's name over the past year, totaling approximately $38,000. She paused. In exchange for his cooperation, prosecutors will consider a reduced charge arrangement, but that decision rests with the district attorney's office and will take time. I thought about the screenshot in Emily's envelope, the blue bubbles on the phone screen. Once that clears, we move everything to the holding account. Now I knew whose hands had been on the other side of those transactions, a man in a building downtown who had made $38,000 to look away from the right documents at the right moments. What happens to Jason tonight? I asked. He'll be processed and held pending arraignment, Walsh said. Given the financial charges and the circumstances of the physical removal, the district attorney will likely request remand at the arraignment hearing based on flight risk. Jason Holt's professional background in lending means he understands how to move assets across jurisdictions. That works in our favor when arguing for remand. She walked me through the charge categories carefully. False imprisonment for what happened at Pine Ridge. Domestic violence for the bruising on Emily's arm, documented by the medical examination Sandra had taken her to the morning after I brought her home. Mortgage fraud and forgery as felony charges under California law, each carrying potential sentences of 2 to 5 years individually. Conspiracy charges connecting Jason and Marcus Webb. The monitored transfer of $50,000 adding a wire fraud element that crossed into federal jurisdiction, which meant the district attorney's office was already in contact with the federal prosecutor's office about concurrent charges. Emily listened to each category without flinching. She had the particular stillness of someone absorbing information they already suspected, but needed to hear confirmed. When Walsh finished, Emily asked one question. The house, she said. What happens to the house? The mortgage application was fraudulent, Walsh said. Westbridge Capital will be notified and the application will be voided. Your title remains clean. The property is yours. Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them, they were dry and clear. After Walsh left, I walked outside and stood on my porch in the March evening air and thought about the phone call that had started all of this, the 2 in the morning darkness, and Emily's voice pressed small and careful through a bad connection. And I thought about the 71 days I had found on Jason's power of attorney document, the clock he had set running, and how far we had come from that number. We had not used 71 days. We had used 19. Across the street, Maggie's porch light was on. Through my own front window, I could see Emily still sitting at the table and Sandra moving around her, and Danny turning pages, and the ordinary furniture of my ordinary house containing the people I cared about most in the world, all of them still there, all of them intact. I went back inside and closed the door behind me. Patricia had told me I did not need to go to the station that night. She had told me precisely and without sentiment that there was nothing productive I could accomplish by being there, that Walsh had everything she needed, that the arraignment would happen in the morning, and I should sleep and let the legal process do what it was designed to do. I went anyway. I sat in the waiting area of the Sacramento County Sheriff's substation on Freeport Boulevard for 2 hours and 20 minutes. The chairs were the molded plastic kind, connected in rows the color of old mustard. A vending machine hummed in this corner. A deputy behind the front desk typed steadily without looking up. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed at a frequency just below the threshold of conscious irritation, the kind of sound you do not notice until you have been sitting beneath it long enough that it becomes the only thing you can hear. At 9:10, Patricia arrived in a gray overcoat with a leather document case under her arm and sat down beside me without asking why I was there, which told me she had already understood why I was there before she walked in. "He's asking for a deal," she said. I looked at her. Already, Marcus Webb's cooperation changed his calculations significantly. She set the document case on her knees. When a co-conspirator is already talking, the value of your own silence drops to almost nothing. Jason's attorney made contact with the district attorney's office 40 minutes after the arrest. They want to know what a guilty plea to the primary charges would look like in terms of sentencing. "What does it look like?" I asked. "The DA wants felony convictions on the record. False imprisonment, mortgage fraud, forgery, conspiracy. Domestic violence as a separate count given the documented injury." She paused. "In exchange for a guilty plea and full cooperation on the asset recovery. They would recommend a sentence of 4 years in state custody with eligibility for parole consideration after 30 months plus restitution covering the full value of the fraudulent transfers, the voided mortgage costs, and Emily's medical and legal expenses." I thought about the vending machine humming in the corner and the deputy typing behind the desk and the plastic chairs the color of old mustard. I thought about the 71 days on Jason's power of attorney document and the 19 days we had actually needed. "What does Emily want?" I asked. "I spoke with her an hour ago," Patricia said. "She wants the felony record. She wants the restitution. She does not want to testify at a trial if a guilty plea accomplishes the same outcome." Patricia met my eyes steadily across the waiting room. "That is a reasonable position, and I support it." I nodded. "Then support it." I did not see Jason that night. I had imagined I might some accidental corridor crossing some moment where our eyes met through a window in a door, and I had spent some portion of the 2 hours imagining what I would say if that happened, running through sentences and discarding them one by one, because none of them contained what I actually wanted to communicate, which was not a sentence at all, but simply the knowledge that I had found her. That Emily was home and the walls around this building were doing exactly what walls are supposed to do. The building was larger than it looked from outside, and the people in it moved through separate channels. And what I was given instead was the knowledge that he was somewhere inside these walls, and that the legal process Patricia had spent 3 weeks building was now holding him in the place where it could do its work without any further assistance from me. I drove home at 11:15 and slept for 6 hours, which was more than I had managed in any single stretch since the night of February 28th. The months that followed moved the way legal proceedings move in a rhythm that had nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with process. Hearings, continuances, document productions, asset traces. Patricia appeared in court 7 times on matters I did not attend, because she told me my presence would accomplish nothing except to give me something additional to be anxious about. And I had learned by then to trust her assessment of what was necessary and what was not. I filled the time with ordinary things. I called Emily on Wednesdays and asked what she wanted her week to contain, rather than whether the bills were paid. I had coffee with Danny on Saturday mornings and let him explain financial concepts I did not fully understand, because the explanations made him feel useful, and usefulness was something Danny needed. I sat on my porch in the evenings and watched Maggie tend her garden across the street and thought about the long distance between noticing something and deciding to act on it. Marcus Webb pleaded guilty in May to bank fraud and conspiracy charges. His cooperation agreement, which Patricia had been monitoring since his arrest, resulted in a reduced sentence of 18 months in federal custody, followed by 3 years of supervised release and permanent revocation of his financial services license. The judge noted at sentencing that his early cooperation had materially assisted in the recovery of assets that would otherwise have been unrecoverable. I read the sentencing summary Patricia sent me on a Tuesday morning and thought about the man downtown who had made $38,000 to look away from the right documents at the right moments, and I felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief but occupied the territory between them. Jason's guilty plea was entered in June, 8 months after the night of the dinner table. He stood in a courtroom on I Street in downtown Sacramento, 2 blocks from Patricia's office, in a gray suit I did not recognize, and said the words the court required him to say. He acknowledged each charge in the flat, careful voice of a man reading from a document he had negotiated, line by line, and I sat in the 3rd row of the gallery and listened to him say Emily's name in that voice, and felt my hands tighten on my knees, and then deliberately relax them because tightening them accomplished nothing, and I had learned by then to be economical with what I let myself feel in public spaces. The judge sentenced him to 4 years in state custody with parole eligibility after 30 months full restitution and a permanent prohibition on serving in any financial advisory or asset management capacity. His lending license, which he had already surrendered during the investigation, was formally revoked as part of the order. The career that had taught him how to move money through systems, how to find the gaps in documentation processes and widen them quietly, had also generated the paper trail that made every charge provable and every denial implausible. Emily sat beside me when the sentence was read, with her hands folded in her lap and Sandra on her other side. When the judge finished speaking, Emily exhaled slowly through her nose and did not cry and did not speak. And I understood that for her the moment was not a conclusion so much as a confirmation of something she had known was coming and had simply been waiting to have made official. The relief on her face was quiet and inward, the relief of a woman who had carried a weight long enough to forget what it felt like to stand without it, and was only now beginning to remember. Outside the courthouse on the steps in the June light that Sacramento does in early summer, warm and direct, and without apology, Emily turned to me and said, "Is it strange that I feel sorry for him?" I thought about it honestly the way she deserved. I thought about the bicycle memory that had never quite left me the afternoon years ago when I watched a younger version of Jason help Emily carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs in her first apartment, laughing when they dropped something steady when it mattered. People are rarely only one thing. That does not excuse the other things, but it makes the grief more honest. "No," I said. "You spent 2 years building a life with someone you believed in. Feeling sorry for what he turned out to be is not the same as excusing what he did." She nodded slowly. "I'm going to need to think about that for a while." "You have time," I said. The asset recovery took until August. The fraudulent mortgage was voided, and Westbridge Capital facing its own regulatory inquiry as a result of Marcus Webb's disclosures, settled a civil claim that returned the full $320,000 to Emily's clear title. The withdrawn funds from the joint checking account were partially recovered through the restitution order and partially through a civil judgment against Jason's remaining assets. The $50,000 monitored transfer was returned in full. Patricia filed the final accounting in late August, and by the time she did, the numbers told a story that none of us had expected at the beginning. I did not fully understand the mathematics until Danny explained it to me at his kitchen table on an afternoon in September with the same yellow legal pad and the same careful small handwriting and the afternoon light coming through the window, the way it does in California in autumn, warm and specific and slightly golden, the kind of light that makes ordinary kitchen tables look like they belong in a painting. Danny set his pen down and looked at the final column of figures. "She came out ahead," he said simply. I sat with that for a moment, turning it over, the way you turn over something unexpected, to check whether it is as solid as it appears. "The restitution covered the principal," Danny said, tapping the legal pad. "The civil judgment added interest calculated from the date of each unauthorized transaction. Westbridge's settlement included penalty damages on top of the mortgage principal. Emily's legal fees were covered under the fee-shifting provision Patricia built into the civil complaint." He set the pen down. "Robert, after everything she recovered $260,000 against the $180,000 that was taken. The additional $80,000 represents what the law calls consequential damages. It is the cost they paid for causing the harm, not just the cost of the harm itself." I looked at the numbers on the yellow legal pad and thought about the night I had sat in my dark kitchen with a glass of water I had not touched, and the phone screen lighting up with my daughter's name, and the 19 days that had followed, and everything that had been built from that single decision to answer on the second ring. "Yes," I said. She did. Emily moved back into her house in late September, after the locks had been changed, and the mortgage voided, and the last of Jason's belongings removed by a moving company Patricia had arranged, so that Emily would not have to be present while it happened. She asked me to come with her the first night, not to stay, just to walk through the rooms with her, while she reacquainted herself with the dimensions of a life that belonged to her again. We went room by room. She touched the door frames and the window sills and the kitchen counter where her yellow notepad used to sit, and she stood in the bedroom doorway for a long time without going in, and then she went in. And that was that. She did not perform any of it. She just did it the way she had always done the hard things, by moving toward them, rather than waiting for them to become easier. The geraniums in the window boxes were dead. She noted this without distress, and said she would replant them in spring. In November, I drove to a hardware store on a Saturday morning and bought 2 gallons of paint in a color called Harvest Afternoon, a warm yellow that was close enough to the shade Emily had chosen at age 7 that Sandra confirmed it from a photograph she had kept of Emily's childhood bedroom. I loaded the cans into the trunk and drove to Emily's house and knocked on the door even though I had a key, because knocking felt right. Emily opened the door in old clothes with her hair tied back and looked at the paint cans and said, "You remembered the color." "Sandra helped," I said. "Come in," she said. We moved the furniture to the center of the room and covered it with drop cloths the way Margaret and I had done when we painted this same room 30 years ago, when Emily was 3 and too young to help, but sat on the covered dresser and handed us brushes with the serious authority of a child who has decided she is participating. I told Emily this while we worked, and she laughed a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, and the sound of it in that room was the best thing I had heard in 8 months. We painted through the morning and into the afternoon. Emily handled the roller with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting for a physical task that required nothing from her except effort, and I did the trim work along the baseboards the way I had always done it, slowly and with a small brush, because rushing trim work is how you end up with yellow on the white ceiling. And Margaret spent 20 years reminding me of the one time I had made that mistake. At some point, Sandra arrived with sandwiches and sat on the covered dresser, eating and watching us work and making observations about our technique that were not entirely complimentary. And Maggie came by in the late afternoon with a plant in a terracotta pot, a small geranium red for the windowsill, because Maggie understood that some things needed to begin before they were ready, rather than after. We finished as the light was going flat and golden through the window, that particular late afternoon light that California does in November, turning everything it touches into something that looks like a memory before it has finished happening. Emily stood in the center of the room with her roller in her hand and looked at the walls. The color was right. Not identical to what it had been when she was 7, because paint colors shift with age and light and the eyes that look at them, but right in the way that mattered, warm and present in hers. I thought about the night 8 months ago when I had sat in my dark kitchen and watched a phone screen light up with my daughter's name. I thought about the drive to Pine Ridge in the March evening light, and the key on the metal ring, and the corridor with the burgundy carpet and the door at the end of it. I thought about what it had cost to get from that door to this room, not in money or time, though it had cost those things too, but in the harder currency of understanding what you have been willing not to see, and why, and what it means to stop. I had built my trust in Jason on Emily's choice of him, and I had maintained it on convenience, and I had almost lost my daughter to my own willingness to accept a comfortable version of events over an uncomfortable true one. That was not Jason's doing. That was mine. Carrying it was not the same as being destroyed by it, but it was not something I intended to set down entirely either, because the weight of it was the thing that would keep me paying attention from here forward. Emily turned and looked at me with paint on her forearm and her hair coming loose from its tie, and she smiled in the way she used to smile when she was small and had just accomplished something she was proud of, fully and without reservation. "It looks right," she said. "It does," I said. She crossed the room and put her arms around me the way she had not done since the night I found her. Not the careful lean of someone relearning safety, but a real embrace, her chin on my shoulder and her arms around my back. And I held my daughter in the room we had painted together, in the color she had chosen 30 years ago, and I thought about all the rooms in all the houses where families were keeping their difficult things carefully out of sight. And I thought about what it had taken to stop doing that. And I thought that the cost of stopping was considerably less than the cost of continuing. Outside the window, the light was almost gone. The new geranium on the sill caught the last of it, one small red point of color against the darkening glass. Emily stepped back and picked up her roller. "Same time next week," she said. "The hallway could use a coat." "Same time next week," I said. I used to believe that staying quiet was the same as keeping the peace. I know now that it is not. Silence inside a family does not protect anyone. It only protects the conditions that allow harm to continue. God gave me 19 days to do what Jason believed would take me a lifetime to attempt. I am grateful for every one of them. If this family story sounds familiar, if you have looked away from something because looking at it was inconvenient, I am asking you not to make the choice I almost made. Do not wait for the moment to be perfect. Do not wait until the evidence is impossible to ignore. The person who needs you is already counting the days. My personal belief is simple. Love without attention is not enough. Presence without honesty is not enough. The people we care about deserve both, not occasionally, not when it is easy, but consistently and without condition. These grandpa stories do not end with perfect families. They end with real ones. Families that have been broken and chosen to rebuild anyway on honesty instead of appearances. If this family story reached you today, leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if these grandpa stories have meant something to you, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Every family story we tell here is told because someone needed it to be told. Thank you for staying until the end. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements created for the purpose of reflection and education. If that is not what you are looking for today, step away and find what serves you best. But if you are still here, I will see you in the next one.